Hello, my name is Jeremy Nathaniel Akers, and I'm here to talk to you about change hacking. This is the third part in a series I did for the Management 3.0 community here in Amsterdam, and we're talking about how to capture the high ground. Effectively, how to build movements that just cannot be ignored. And these are the patterns that I think we're going to see more and more come into the foreground if you're thinking about business agility and stuff like that. TLDR, if you want to just take my word for it, and there is going to be a lot of presumption, I'm sorry in this, nurture the evolutionary potential of the present. That's the long and short of it. Evolution is the force that we are trying to get into right relationship and alignment and take advantage of, so do that. So first and foremost, where are we coming from? Most people have this beautiful vision of coherence in their brain, right? How can we get everybody's nose in the same direction so that we're working towards the same goal? I think that is effectively a bad idea. And the reason I think that's a bad idea is because every now and then you get one of these. Some enormous exogenous shock that makes the viability of this whole direction just sort of fall to zero. And then we're all dead. This is in evolutionary terms, this is a terminus, right? A termination. This line, this direction, nope, is a no. And evolution wants us to now go this way or some other random direction in response to it. So maybe the specific nodes in this network are able to switch and reorient themselves to the trade winds of the present. But generally, this I see as systemic risk. It's a bad thing. I'm much more happier in an environment where we are dealing with all of these different opinions, directions, opportunities, these different vectors, and we're just able to take advantage of wherever these things want to go and go, all right, cool. So, let's help you explore that, make it happen. So why would I commit such heresy? So here we're going to invoke the Cynefin sense-making framework. It takes way too long to explore all this, so I'll just jump into the TLDR. Organizations are complex adaptive systems existing within complex adaptive systems. So there's a sort of isomorphy in there. We're stacked inside of our stack. What does that mean? Oh, and let me just pause for a moment. I'm really proud of this model I made with my son of the 3D version of this guy in Duplo during the lockdown. I haven't had an opportunity to show it to anybody, so here you guys go. Thanks so much for allowing me to gush. So complex adaptive systems. Complex adaptive systems have a specific sort of recipe for how we want to move through them. In this environment, our constraints are enabling, but we usually don't know them. So we have to do this probe thing where we run an experiment to sort of figure out where are the boundaries, where are the edges, where are our constraints that we can conform to. And then we've got to, of course, do some form of sensing. Oh, here, not here, not over there, right? To make sense of that. And then, of course, we've got to deal with the fact that, hey, we've got a constraint here. How do we conform ourselves correctly to it? So we need some response. And a lot of the times what we're going to do is we're going to find out a constraint, some boundary, and we're going to have something lying around in the kitchen that we've used in maybe a completely different situation. We're going to try that, right? We're going to exapt our way through complexity a lot of the times rather than reinventing the wheel. Is there anything else? Aporia. Confusion is actually a really, really, really good way to go about it. So rather than presuming that you're in one of these domains, just start out confused and figure it out from there. Again, organizations are complex adaptive systems. So we're going to probe, we're going to sense, we're going to respond, and I'm going to show you what I think is effectively one general recipe, one big recipe and three sort of styles, from the most simple and maybe elegant perhaps, to the most structured and complicated. Um, and I see that I noted myself that we can also think of them as second order chaotic systems. So that is, a first order chaotic system is like the weather. Even when I predict it, weather doesn't matter. I'm either right-ish or wrong-ish, more often than not wrong-ish. Second order chaotic system is like financial markets. My prediction of a financial market exerts an influence upon the rest of the participants in the market, and therefore changes itself. So it responds to predictions and interference and the ability to interface with it. Let me not get caught up in that. Sorry for the tangent, but I think that shit is interesting. So our first recipe is by a dude once upon a time, still as a matter of fact, named Chris Patton. So Chris is a dude that is all about all things Agile and DevOps over in the UK, and he started to experiment with something called guilds. You probably know about guilds as communities of practice. Chris, I think, thinks about guilds as a little bit more broadly. So I think, I'm putting words in his mouth, but I'm going to tell his story as I understand it. He created this space that was kind of sort of amoebic in nature. And what I mean is the boundaries, it had a boundary about it, but that boundary was always moving around and crawling and doing something different and finding something and gobbling it up and moving through the organization. He created basically an unstructured space by inviting people to come hang out with him once every week at a set time. And there was no agenda for that time, and the participants was varied continuously, but it did something interesting, that it created a sort of vibe. And even though they didn't have any topic, and there was not an explicit idea about talking about the work, the business, the organization, the content of working together, things sort of came up. And so as I've heard him describe it, there was a sort of ebb and flow that was associated with this movement of having this unstructured time that for sure, people would show up, sometimes lots of people would show up, sometimes very few people would show up. So it just sort of did its thing. But slowly over time, there was this accrual of influence and of understanding. The way I've heard Chris talk about it is you just had a way of sort of knowing who had participated in these guild sessions when you were out sort of interfacing in the wider organization, because they had a sort of way of looking at things and communicating and being in the space that could tell that they exported back into the organization as a whole. And so we've got a little quote from Schopenhauer. All truth passes through three stages. First, it's ridiculed. Second, it's violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as obviously self-evident. So basically, first, how cute a guild. That's adorable. What guild? I have no idea what you're talking about. With time, as more people sort of show up and some form of lore spreads through the organization, some bean counter or critical person will ask a legitimate question, which is, hey, should we be spending people's time on this thing that is not directly related to our explicit business goals? And with time, though, the influence that accrues will, of course, yield some shared resource and some result, which, of course, everybody will clamor to take credit for, right? Oh, yes, I was at the guild before it was a cool guild, before anybody went to the guild. So this is a way of influencing these complex dynamic systems of organizations in a very bottoms up, very organic, very loosey-goosey way. Like I said, it's pretty simple. 1 hour a week, no agenda, open invite, and things happen throughout the organization. The next model I'm going to show you comes from a very friendly troll by the name of Mr. Dave Snowden, and he talks about entangled trios. So basically, what you do is you take a senior person in the organization, what you can almost refer to as a leaver, somebody sort of in the end of life of their career in the space. You take a joiner, somebody who is fresh from the outside world and just finding their way in the space, and somebody else, and you give them 1 hour per week, for example, to form a peer support network, right? So you entangle these three individuals, entangling, creating some relationship between them in these trios. And the peer support slash mentorship, reverse mentorship, whatever you want to call it, does something. It develops relationships between these two individuals, or three individuals, hopefully outside of the standard explicit organizational structure, right? So the idea is that this guy can be from one department, from finance or HR. This guy can be from sales or the business side. This guy can be a techno whatever, a support worker, etc., etc., etc. And with time, you rotate the membership of these trios about every 6 months. And the whole idea is that in about 3 years, you've got an organization where, given your scale, maybe not everybody knows everybody, but everybody knows somebody from every part of the organization. So this creates a web of relationships that are certainly informal, but much often more effective than formal lines of communication, right? Oh, I know somebody over in that department. Why don't I give him a call and he can point me in the right direction? It's much faster than, hey, how do we find out? And maybe I'll talk to my manager who will talk to their manager, yada, yada, yada. Why get caught up in the bureaucracy when we can just know each other and reach out? Obviously takes some amount of time, but that increasing the web of relationships creates much more resilience in an organizational structure. And resilience, if we come back to this idea of evolution, is a good thing, right? I want to be resilient and highly adaptable. I don't necessarily want to be the most fit or strongest, quote unquote, but I want to have the highest capacity for change, right? Think about Keegan development cycle, the transforming self. I think Keegan 4, right? So that is our second sort of recipe for transformation. Pretty simple, straightforward. Now we're going to go to something much more complicated and maybe a little bit more anyway, let me not step on it. So this is a test card for an experiment. I call it a meta-experiment. And the effective hypothesis is that I believe that crowdsourcing culture or organizational change can enable new relationships to form and engage entrepreneurship. Lots of good stuff can happen. And to verify that, what we'll basically do is run an innovation program on the topic of culture or organizational change. We'll give everybody effectively that 1 hour per week per quarter, so 8 hours per full-time employee. And we will measure a whole raft of stuff to see if people are engaging with the program, how they're participating versus whether they're making use of that time or giving it away, the participation in other stuff that we're doing, whether we have retrospectives or sprint review, And we're also going to keep track of some nifty stuff around social network analysis. So you can graph a web of relationships, and there's a math that is associated with those graphs, with those networks. And so we can turn this abstract idea of let's build some great relationships, man, into something a bit more empirical, a bit more quantitative than purely qualitative. Not that there's anything wrong with qualitative. And so some of the factors I think are most interesting in this social network analysis space is closeness centrality, the distance between any two nodes in the network, how many connections it takes to get from A to B, the density, so what is the overall volume of connections within the network, the clustering coefficient, how well connected is my sort of local network, my team, my squad, the people I'm most connected to. Do we have lots of connections all over the network? Or are we kind of stuck within a little bit of a bubble? And if we're right about this experiment, about this open innovation pipeline or this innovation pipeline on culture change, then we'll see lots of good things happen around engagement, participation, and the social networking networks. We'll see more velocity, less features in this blocked or at-risk status, and that a lot of people will make use of their time, and that things will be so cool that we'll want to do it all the time. This has already taken a little long. I apologize. So basically the idea is to run an experiment season, right? An experiment season. So think of this as a distributed innovation pipeline within your organization where the topic is the organization itself. Also, it's like a hackathon, but spread out over time, right? Which is why I refer to this a lot as a culture hackathon, because we can take that time and spread it out over 3 months. And what we invite people to do is to take all of their nifty and novel ideas, and for sure we've got some process that can support them to submit their ideas for organizational change or culture change most specifically. And we use the same test card format to ensure that we're getting verifiable or falsifiable hypotheses, and we get some form of estimation. And then we collect all these things, and then we converge some form of marketplace where people pitch their ideas, and they say, hey, I might need some folks like this to help me out with this thing. And then everybody has this budget of 8 hours per quarter that they can spend on, whatever hypothesis they think is the most interesting. And maybe you create some sort of pass-fail gateway for them to get backing. I don't know if that's interesting, but it could be an enabling constraint. And then, of course, after the end of this marketplace and this election, so to speak, we do some form of evaluation. What ideas did we think that I thought were great got less traction? What were the sleeper ideas that people really got behind? This can give us a heat map all by itself of where there's energy for. And then, of course, we prototype, we run our experiment. We offer some tooling, some coaching, some help organizing the experiment. And on the flip side, we invite people to fill out a learning card, the pair of that test card here, so that we can be very rigorous about how did it go. And we can make some evaluative statements and analysis. And at the end of the quarter, we do effectively, just like a hackathon, some form of a dragon's den. So, hey, what did you learn by your experiment, and how do you know, right? What is the criteria that makes you so confident that of your learning? And we give people the opportunity to sort of vote, because I like democracy for some reason. So we give some people the ability to vote. Is this a great idea that we should be pursuing? and make sort of canon or official, put it in the books and give it a budget and make it, let it go, baby, go? Is this an idea that requires some more iteration, but we're on to something? We should pivot and keep trying? Or is it hot garbage and we should just drop it like it's hot? And then, of course, you go back to those metrics that we talked about and evaluate the whole program and rinse and repeat if you like where this thing is going. So, like I said, a much more complicated version of creating these bubbles of opportunity for people to do stuff that is not necessarily related to their functional, explicit task in the organization. So, what are the patterns that I think each of these three recipes sort of have in place? Well, first and foremost, I think that we're enabling a form of positive deviancy. We are allowing things to sort of shift and change in ways that we think are good. I like this. Personally, I like this notion of hard-to-stop experiments. I'm trying to create hard-to-stop experiments that I don't need anybody's permission to run, that I can just give a go to and see what happens. So again, away from the content and allow agency to sort of emerge. So the heuristic that I attach to this is just keep moving, right? Run lots of experiments. And run lots of them, preferably in parallel, so that we can make use of that evolutionary force. There it is again. And that leads to some experiments proving themselves viable, right? And about the viability of those experiments, we want to stay in contact. We want to work together and take note of the sort of culture bubbles of where these things land and find themselves effective, right? I want hard to stop experiments, and those experiments will invariably sort of generate a field effect around them that will change what is possible, what is probable within the confines of that bubble. Really, who is it possible for you to be when you're inside that bubble? And upregulating the possibility for dynamism and good results is a good thing, right? So we're creating these sort of pockets of more dynamism in the organizational culture, and these pockets of dynamism also turn out to be some form of strange attractor, right? By capturing this high ground. What do I mean by that? These bubbles become this sort of shining beacon for people that are looking for that type of vibe and that type of action. And this shining beacon can become a sort of gathering place for friendlies. And again, that's what I'm talking about, a strange attractor. This is the accrual of influence that with time becomes undeniable. And that can fuel further positive deviance by helping people to export this vibe, these potentialities, these practices even perhaps, into new contexts, more positive deviance, more emergent agency, and an expansion or spread of these culture bubbles. And of course, not all of these things are going to prove viable, but again, we're nurturing this evolutionary force where we're creating lots of opportunities to try lots of different things, because many of them will fail, but a few of them will succeed. And those few that will succeed, well, the ones that last the longest are the ones that are fit for the context. And then we're really evolving. Then we're really coming in and delivering the promise of sort of teal organizations, evolutionary organizations. Not because we're using bells or burning incense or meditating, but we are actually, again, nurturing and managing and making use of this wonderful negative entropic phenomenon that is evolution, that creates order from what is apparent chaos and more complex order, especially. Anything else? Yes, of course. So these are just 3 of these recipes that exist within a much larger landscape of things that I think are doing similar type of actions that have something in common with a lot of these different practices that are many are sort of on the either cutting edge or the fringe of the sort of organization / agile space. This is my pitch for a starting place for what I think of as the Agile Reformation. So maybe you can think of these as 95 theses about how the direction that I think Agile needs to and is going in. So my personal favorite around liberating structures, how can we unleash and include everyone? And these are adjacent. This graph, by the way, is just chaos. This is the way this stuff popped into my brain. So please don't read too much into the way these things are connected. But there is a relationship, of course, between liberating structures and open space. Open space, especially used as an entire transformation, almost methodology. There is a triad around open space, S3, and beyond budgeting that Jutta Eckstein has put together in the Bossa Nova, which again refers to beyond budgeting, open space, S3, and agile. So the Bossa Nova. There is holacracy, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of. There is, strategic doing by Ed Morrison, a guy who has sort of put in the grind of complex multi-stakeholder collaboration in communities. So in real live pluralities, that is the lived space, and has come up with a method that enables actual productive work to get done. There is practices like appreciative inquiry. We already made a nod to Dave Snowden and the work that he does in the around the Cynefin sense-making framework. There is U theory with Otto Scharmer, right? This very simple process of, to super oversimplify, to observe, retreat and reflect, thinking about the places of greatest possibility, and then just to act in an instant, prototyping solutions, and rinse and repeat. There's the work in systems innovation, right? So increasing the salience and recognition about complexity science and systems thinking, and how do we use this larger panorama view about the whole, not just the organization, but the ecosystem within which the organization and systems the organization find themselves in, to act holistically. And, speaking of complexity and systems thinking, the work that Nora Bateson is doing in the Warm Data Lab is super awesome. We talk about abductive process, these places creating this space for super novel insights to arise through the exploration. And then there's a lot of stuff going on. There's Chris and his work around Guildcraft. There is the work of Rich Bartlett around, you may know him from Lumio and Spiral, his work around micro-solidarity, patterns for decentralized collaboration. There's, of course, where is it? Reinventing work in the sort of integral space. I brought up Keegan earlier, Management 3.0, the practice of network weaving, right? So thinking explicitly about mapping social networks and creating new connections within them. There is the Manifesto for Slow Thinking, and the associated processes for thinking, for engaging intentional, yeah, starting well and continuing well in the project space. There is a lot of interesting stuff that the guys in Corporate Rebels are banging around in and bumping into. There is one of my all-time favorite heroes of the sort of complexity and living human system space, which is system-centered training, and Yvonne Agazarian and Susan Gant is the forerunner in that space. A theory, a method, and a practice you can look at for integrating integrating differences within groups. Really good stuff. There is the intersubjective practices around circling and voice dialogues. There's a sort of interesting triad when you think about revealing minority perspectives and making use of that wisdom that exists in the organizational context. Shout out to my dude James. There's all types of really interesting things happening, emerging in what I have no other name but the we space, right? If you think about the heavy hitters, Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jordan Hall, John Vervaeke, all the dudes, Zach Stein, and the Consilience Project, Guy Sengstock, to refer back to circling again. Just a lot of really interesting shit happening in this intersubjective meta everything space. There's the work around constellations, and another great way of making explicit the relationships between things. And there is the stuff that I'm working on personally around the Think Slow Dojo, right? Trying to discover an intersubjective practice that is participatory and exploratory, really by focusing on practice first rather than talking so much about theory, and which I've done more than my fair share of in this video. So this is my pitch for Agile Reformation. These are the type of practices that I think Agile is going to continue to need to integrate and become much more of a voice than I think even the sort of hard technologies around sec dev triceratops and the God only knows about scaling, right? So I talked around Agile Reformation, and maybe it's good to close on the most explicit pitch I can give. So Agile is now 20 years deep since the creation of the manifesto, when it became explicit, even though it was going on for quite some time. And, consultancy has promised the world, but from where I live and exist in the Netherlands, the transformations have already happened, right? ING, Rabobank, ABN AMRO, for Christ's sake, all of the big banks here have already adopted agility and their own version of a scaled agile framework. So the McKinseys of the world have already rolled out their big digital transformations and then their agile transformations. And I think a lot of the marketplace is still left wanting for the promise that Agile was intended to deliver. However, we're still thinking back to that complicated worldview that is trying to get everybody's nose in the same direction. And we're still missing this this integrative practice of dealing with these differences in direction in a functional way that is not, you're going the wrong direction, get the fuck out of here. Get with the program. So I think there's going to be a lot more dynamism sort of required to get to the holy grail of business agility, which is, I think, not a shock to anyone. And I think you're going to need a lot more fringe practices to really get there at anything that would look like scale. And that is building the negative capacity to deal with uncertainty and the messiness that is life, so that our organizations can mirror the complexity in the outside world. So rather than trying to squish things into the complicated worldview and make complicated process out of what is inherently complex, how can we leave things as much as we can in the complex domain so that, again, the organization looks like the outside world and can therefore deal with and respond to the pressures of the outside world when our challenges are unknown and perhaps, until they're not, unknowable. And that requires us to lean into this space of confusion, to be very obvious and very explicit about it. So again, coming back to whatever your preferred model is, if you think about the integral stage in spiral dynamics, the self that transforms in the Keegan development stages, we're going to need a lot more tooling that really helps us get to this developmental stage that can deal with that and doesn't look at it like it's a threat. Because if I say confused and you go, I don't want that, you're already behind the times. And my pitch for Agile Reformation is that you're going to want and need more of this stuff in order to catch up and get ahead. So again, how do we engage and nurture the evolutionary potential? I think a lot of these practices and the ones that I talked about at length give us an, I want to say unfair advantage, but it's really quite fair, right? They allow us to come as close as possible to the messiness that evolution actually is. Because remember, not everybody makes it in the developmental process. So not every experiment is going to make it, and that's okay. Not every organization is going to make it, and that's okay. In the local particularity, it may not feel okay, but that's why we need this stuff to help us deal with all of that not okayness. And the better we can do that, the better we'll be able to experiment and adapt to the change in the times. A lot gets talked about for paradigm shift, but what we're talking about that is coming down the pipeline, I think, is much more like an epochal shift. It's much more like the Cambrian explosion. It's going to be a whole new game, right? When humans emerged onto the scene and invented language and culture, that just totally redesigned the face of the earth. And we're probably looking at the beginning of that next step when we talk about the rest of the 21st century. So these are the things that I think can help us get to the future. Thanks so much for your time, attention, and energy, and good luck out there. Cushious. And my question for you, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, if you're still listening this long, thank you. That's awesome. My question for you is, what else? What else? What are the other things that you see that are aligned with the portions of these type of things that you already know about, that you go, oh, some of that, some of that, some of that here in these spaces. There's all types of stuff that I've never heard of that you've tried and you think, oh yeah, those have got potential. They line up with this stuff. So what are those things? If you can leave a comment, send me a message on LinkedIn. If you can help point me in the directions that I'm hopefully pointing at in some form of coherency, I would really, really appreciate it as I continue this exploration. So again, thank you so much for your time, attention, and energy, and good luck out there surviving into the future.